The last stone hit her back when she was almost hidden behind the bend in the road. Maria did not turn around, did not scream, only pressed her daughter closer to herself and quickened her pace. Behind her there was laughter, rough, malicious, merciless, the laughter of those who just yesterday called themselves neighbors. Shouts followed them, promising imminent death in the cold cave. The crowd mocked the very idea of surviving in that stone hole where they used to store grain. They were certain the first snow would be the last for mother and daughter. Little Anna pressed against her mother's side, her eyes wide open, but she did not cry at 6 years old. The girl had already learned to be silent when adults became scary. Maria felt how the fragile body of her daughter trembled under the worn dress. She ran her hand through the child's dark hair, trying to calm her, though she herself did not know what awaited them ahead. Deep down, the woman understood. She had made a promise she might not be able to keep, but there was no other way out. The village of Kamenibrod had stood in the valley for more than 200 years. Houses of gray stone and darkened wood huddled together, as if trying to warm themselves in each other's embrace. The streets were narrow, the windows small, the people harsh and merciless to strangers. Here, only those who stuck together survived. Here, there was no place for the weak. And Maria became weak on the day her husband Pyotr did not return from the hunt. It happened 3 months ago. He went into the forest with a group of men, and only 5 of 6 returned. The body was never found. A bear. Some said his own carelessness. Others claimed Pyotr separated from the group, went after prey alone, and disappeared, as if dissolved in the dense forest. The essence was one. The husband was gone, and Maria was left alone with a child and without a breadwinner. The first weeks the village still helped. Neighbors brought bread, vegetables, sometimes milk, but the help quickly dried up, like water in a dried well. Everyone had their own concerns, their own families, their own problems, and Maria was a stranger. She came to the village only 7 years ago when she married Pyotr. Her roots were not here. Her ancestors did not live in Kamenibrod for centuries, were not buried in the local cemetery. And when the woman could not pay her share for using the common well, the village's patience ran out. Elder Vasily announced the decision at the general meeting on a cold October morning. When the first frost already covered the ground with a silvery crust, he stood before the gathered residents and pronounced the sentence. Maria could not pay, could not work on par with men. She had become a burden for the community and had to leave. No one objected, not even those who once smiled at her on the street, not even those with whom she shared the holiday table. The silence was absolute, heavy as a tombstone. Maria tried to object, to explain that she had nowhere to go. Her parents had long passed away. The city was 3 days' journey away. With a child, she would not make it before winter came, but the elder only shrugged and turned away, showing that the conversation was over. Then the woman made a decision that many considered complete madness. She announced that she would go live in the old cave on the hillside. The crowd froze for a moment, and then exploded with laughter. People laughed so hard that tears ran down their faces. To the cave, that very abandoned hole in the rock, where even in summer it was damp and cold, where in winter the wind roamed so that it could freeze a person in one night. Vasily shook his head with an expression of mocking pity on his face. He was sure the woman would not last there even a month. The very first serious snowfall would be the end for her and the child. But Maria did not change her decision. She turned around and walked away, and Anna walked beside her, holding tightly to her mother's hand. Laughter and angry shouts followed them for a long time, until mother and daughter disappeared behind the bend in the road leading to the hill. The first thing Maria saw when approaching the cave was a dark, gaping hole in the hillside. The entrance was wide, almost 3 meters, but low. One had to bend down to enter. Inside it smelled of dampness, earth, and something ancient, long forgotten. Anna stopped at the entrance, looking into the darkness with undisguised fear. The girl trembled not only from the cold, but also from terror of the unknown. Maria crouched next to her daughter, hugged her shoulders, and quietly explained that the scariest thing was not the cave, but people who turn away from those who need help. This is just stone and earth. They can make a home out of this. The girl nodded, though the fear in her eyes did not completely disappear. Holding hands, they went inside. Weak light penetrated through the entrance, illuminating the first few meters of the cave. The floor was uneven, covered with small stones and sand. The walls were rough, in places wet from water seeping through the rock. The vault rose about 2.5 meters at its highest point. Maria slowly walked deeper, Peering into the darkness, the cave went about 20 meters, then narrowed to a narrow passage where she did not dare to go, but the main part was quite spacious, about 10 meters long and 5 wide enough for two. Anna shivered from the cold. Pressing against her mother, Maria promised that it would be warmer soon. She left her daughter at the entrance and went in search of materials. The woman did not want to return to the village. She could no longer bear those mocking faces, but nearby stood an old half-ruined barn that no one used there. She found several boards, a rusty bucket, a coil of old rope, and a piece of tarpaulin. Not much, but it was a beginning. Maria returned to the cave and began to work. The woman was not weak. As the villagers saw her, she grew up in a family where her father was a carpenter and her mother a weaver from childhood. Maria knew how to work with her hands, to plan, to solve problems. It's just that after marriage, she allowed Pyotr to take on the heavy work, as was customary in the village, but now there was no choice. First, she began to collect stones around the cave. There were many of them, large, medium, small. Maria dragged them to the entrance, stacked them in piles, evaluated which would fit best. Anna helped as she could, carried small pebbles, laid them next to the big ones. The plan was simple: lay out a wall of stones that would partially close the entrance, leaving only a small passage. This would protect from the wind and not let the cold penetrate inside so freely. The work was exhausting. The stones weighed considerably, and Maria had not done such heavy work in a long time. Her hands quickly became covered with scratches and abrasions. Her back began to ache from constant bending, but the woman continued stone by stone, row by row. By evening, the first small wall was ready. It was uneven, ungainly, but solid. Maria stepped back a pace, evaluating her work. This was a good start, a very good start. Anna confessed that she was hungry. Maria took from the bag the last piece of bread that she managed to grab from home and divided it in half. They sat at the entrance to the cave, slowly chewing dry bread and looking at the village below. Lights were already being lit in the windows. Their smoke rose from the chimneys, spreading in the evening air. People were preparing dinner, warming themselves by the hearths, were warm and safe. And here, on the hill, it was cold and dark. But Maria did not regret her decision, not for a second. The following days passed in continuous work. Maria finished building the wall, reinforced the entrance, collected everything that could be useful. She searched the surroundings within a kilometer radius, collecting branches, dry grass, moss, everything that could serve as fuel or insulation. In the forest, the woman found a fallen tree and with the help of a sharp stone broke off several thick branches. The work took almost the whole day, but she dragged them into the cave and made the simplest frame for a bed, stuffed it with dry grass and moss, put the old tarpaulin on top. It turned out rough, but much softer than the bare stone floor. Fire became the next task. Maria knew how to make flame by friction, but it required time, patience, and considerable effort. She spent a whole day trying to strike a spark from dry branches. Her hands hurt, fingers bled, but the woman did not give up. When the sun was already declining towards sunset, a thin stream of smoke rose from the dry moss. Maria carefully fanned the spark, added dry grass, then thin twigs. The fire flared up. Anna clapped her hands with joy. Her eyes lit up. For the first time in many days, they had fire. Real, living fire. Maria smiled. For the first time since the exile, yes, they have fire, which means they have warmth, which means they have hope, which means they have a chance to survive the winter. She made a fire deep in the cave, away from the entrance, so that smoke would go out through natural cracks in the stone vault. The flame illuminated the walls, and the cave immediately began to seem not so scary, and alien shadows danced on the uneven surfaces. Warmth spread through the air, and Anna truly relaxed for the first time since the exile. They sat by the fire, warming their frozen hands, and Maria told her daughter a fairy tale about a brave girl who was not afraid of the dark, about how one can find a home where others see only emptiness and danger. But the cave and fire were only the beginning. Food was needed, water was needed, warm clothes were needed for the approaching winter. Water was found nearby. A small stream flowed down the hillside about 100 meters from the cave. The water was clean, icy, with the taste of stone and earth. Maria carried it every day in the rusty bucket, trying not to spill a drop. Food was more difficult in the forest. She collected mushrooms, the last berries, nuts, everything that still remained before the onset of cold weather. The woman set several primitive traps from rope and branches, hoping to catch a rabbit or bird. The first days the traps were empty, But Maria did not despair. She continued to check them every morning and every evening. On the fifth day, a partridge was thrashing in one of the traps. Maria had never butchered game herself before. Piotr always did that, but hunger is a good teacher, she managed. Though it was unpleasant and difficult, they roasted the bird over the fire, and the smell of roasted meat filled the cave. Anna ate with such appetite that Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. They would definitely manage. Days passed, and the cave gradually transformed from a cold stone hole into something like a home. The wall at the entrance grew to 1.5 meters, leaving only a narrow passage that could be closed with boards and hides. Maria found the remains of an animal in the forest and took the hide. It came in handy for insulating the entrance. The woman learned to set traps more effectively. Once every few days, she managed to catch a rabbit or bird. She dried meat over the fire, creating reserves in case the hunt became unsuccessful. She also set aside mushrooms and nuts, storing them in the driest corner of the cave. Anna helped with everything she could. The girl collected firewood, carried water, watched the fire. She grew up before her eyes, became stronger, more confident. The fear in her eyes was replaced by determination. One morning, when Maria woke up, she saw that her daughter had already gotten up and was fanning the coals of the fire, adding dry branches. The girl did it carefully, skillfully, without waking her mother. Maria's heart filled with pride and tenderness. They were managing together despite everything. November came with cold winds and gray skies. Trees shed their last leaves, grass withered. The first snow dusted the ground. Maria knew that the real winter was still ahead, but they were ready better than a month ago. The entrance to the cave was reliably reinforced with stones and boards. Cracks were plugged with moss and clay, which the woman found by the stream. Inside, a fire burned constantly, warming the stone walls and creating a reserve of heat. Food supplies were modest, but sufficient not to go hungry. One evening, Maria stood at the entrance to the cave, looking at the village below. Lights still burned in the windows of houses. Smoke still rose from chimneys. Life went on as usual, and it seemed that people had already forgotten about the woman and child they had exiled a month ago. But Maria had not forgotten and had not forgiven. She did not wish them harm, but neither did she feel warm feelings toward those who had driven her and her daughter out to certain, as they thought, death. The woman simply wanted to survive, to prove that they were wrong, to show that strength is not only in numbers, but also in will, perseverance, determination. December began with a sharp cold snap. The temperature dropped, so that in the mornings the bucket of water was covered with a thin crust of ice. Snow fell more often, covering the ground with a thick white blanket. Wind howled and the gorges crept into every crack. But in the cave it was warm. Maria did not stop improving their shelter. She reinforced the entrance with an additional layer of stones, added more moss and clay to the cracks made from branches, and hides a primitive door that closed the passage and did not let cold air penetrate inside. The fire burned constantly. The woman watched over it like a living creature, added branches, stirred the coals. Anna also learned to maintain the flame, and now they worked together, taking turns. The traps worked worse in winter. Animals hid, birds flew south, but Maria adapted. She learned to fish in the stream, breaking through the ice and lowering homemade tackle into the water. There was little fish, but at least something. Reserves of dried meat, mushrooms, and nuts helped to survive days when hunting was unsuccessful. December 23rd began strangely. The sky was covered with heavy leaden clouds, so low that it seemed you could reach them with your hand. The air was motionless, heavy, filled with some anxious expectation. Maria felt it immediately. As soon as she woke up, something was wrong. Something was approaching. She came out of the cave and looked at the sky. Clouds were creeping from the north, black, dense, menacing. The wind had not yet risen, but the air was so cold that it burned the lungs. The woman knew what this meant: a storm, a real winter storm, the kind that happens once in a decade. She quickly returned to the cave and began to prepare. She checked every crack in the wall, plugged all places where wind could break through, brought more firewood, and stacked it deep in the cave so it wouldn't get wet, filled all containers with water, got out all food supplies, and laid them out next to the bed. Anna watched her mother with anxiety. Maria explained to her daughter that a strong storm was coming, and they would not be able to leave the cave for several days. They needed to wait out the bad weather inside, where it was warm and safe. The girl nodded and helped her mother prepare. By evening, the wind rose. At first, it was a light breeze that rustled dry branches and drove snow dust along the ground, but with each hour it intensified, gained power, turned into a roaring beast. By night, the storm hit the valley with such fury that it seemed the world itself decided to destroy all life. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves. It beat against the stone wall at the entrance to the cave, tried to break inside, through snow and ice with such force that the air turned into a solid white wall. The temperature dropped so low that even the stones seemed to crack from the cold. Maria sat by the fire, hugging her daughter. Anna trembled, pressing against her mother, but did not cry. She was a brave girl. The woman added wood to the fire, made sure the flame did not go out. This was their only source of heat, their only protection from the cold. Outside, the world went mad. In the village of Kameny Brod, a real disaster was happening. The wind tore roofs from houses as if they were sheets of paper. Boards and tiles flew through the air, crashed into walls, crippled everything in their path. Snow blocked doors and windows, penetrated every crack, turning houses into ice traps. People tried to save their homes, but the storm was stronger. It broke beams, destroyed walls, extinguished fires, and hearths. Cold crept inside, despite all attempts to resist. Elder Vasily stood in his house, which creaked and groaned under the pressure of the wind, and understood that the village might not survive this night. The roof had already partially collapsed, snow covered half the room, and the wind whistled in the cracks so that it was impossible to warm up even by the fireplace. Families pressed against each other, trying to keep warm. Children cried from fear, and cold adults prayed, hoping that the storm would soon subside. But the storm only intensified. By midnight, it became clear that staying in houses was dangerous. Roofs fell one after another, walls collapsed, cold became deadly. People began to get out, trying to reach stronger buildings or find shelter in the forest. But going outside in such a storm was almost tantamount to suicide. Visibility was zero. Wind knocked you off your feet, cold pierced through and through. Many got lost, just a few meters from their homes. In the cave, Maria and Anna were in relative safety. The stone walls, reinforced by the woman, held the wind. It roared outside like an enraged beast, but could not break inside. The wall of stones worked exactly as Maria had calculated. It took the main blow of the elements and protected the entrance. Snow blocked the cracks between the stones, creating an additional layer of insulation. This was an unexpected gift of nature. The snow barrier did not let cold air through. The fire burned evenly and hotly. The stone walls of the cave, heated by the flame, gave off heat, creating a comfortable temperature inside. The earth beneath them also retained heat, collected over long weeks when the fire burned incessantly. Maria held her daughter in her arms and listened to the howl of the wind outside. She thought about the village, about the people who had ridiculed her decision to live in a cave. She wondered how they were now. Were their strong houses coping with such a storm? The woman felt no gloating, just curiosity. Anna fell asleep in her mother's arms, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the feeling of safety. Maria also allowed herself to doze off, knowing that the fire would burn for a long time, and the supply of wood would last for several days. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. For 3 days the wind tore and threw everything in its path. For 3 days snow fell so thickly that it covered the ground with a layer of more than a meter. For 3 days cold gripped all life with an iron grip. In the cave, time flowed slowly and measuredly. Maria and Anna ate little, saving supplies. They told each other stories, warmed themselves by the fire, listened to the howl of the wind, which gradually became a familiar background. On the 3rd day, the wind began to subside. By evening, it turned into an ordinary winter breeze. The snow stopped falling, the clouds parted, revealing a clear, starry sky. Maria came out of the cave for the first time in 3 days. The world had changed. Everything was covered with a thick layer of snow that sparkled in the moonlight. Trees bent under the weight of ice. The air was clear and frosty. The woman looked at the village, and her heart skipped a beat. The village of Kameny Brod was almost wiped off the face of the earth. Even from a distance of half a kilometer, Maria saw the destruction. The roofs of most houses had disappeared, carried away by the wind. The walls of many buildings had collapsed under the weight of snow. Smoke did not rise from a single chimney. All fires had gone out. The village looked dead. Maria stood at the entrance to the cave and looked at what remained of the place where she had lived for 7 years, the place that had driven her and her daughter out to certain, as they thought, death. But it was the village that died, and the cave survived. The stones held the wind, the earth preserved the warmth, the walls protected from the snow, and mother and daughter survived the storm that destroyed the village. The next morning, Maria gathered Anna, and they descended to the village. What she saw up close was even more terrible. Houses were destroyed, as if a giant beast had passed over them. Beams stuck out from under the snow, like broken bones. Furniture lay everywhere, broken and covered with snow. People survived. Some managed to take shelter in basements. Some waited out the storm in the strongest stone buildings, but they lost almost everything: homes, food supplies, clothes, tools. Vasily sat on the ruins of his house, old and broken, when he saw Maria walking through the village with her daughter by the hand. His eyes widened in amazement. The woman stopped in front of him. She was dressed in simple but intact clothing. Her face was calm. Anna stayed nearby, not trembling from the cold. They looked healthy, unharmed, alive. Vasily looked at them, unable to utter a word. The other villagers also came out of shelters and froze, seeing the exile and her daughter. The same woman they had driven out a month ago, the same one they laughed at when she said she would go live in a cave, the same one they considered doomed. She stood before them whole and unharmed, and their village lay in ruins. Maria did not gloat, did not remind them of how they laughed at her, did not say that she was right and they were wrong. She simply said that there was still room in the cave, that it was warm and safe there, that she could shelter a few people, children and old people first of all. Vasily lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. Several women began to cry. Men were silent, clenching their fists from shame. Maria turned around and walked back to the cave behind her, limping and stumbling. Several people followed. Old widow Katerina, a young mother with an infant, 2 orphan children. The woman accepted them, settled them in the cave, shared the fire, shared food, showed how to protect themselves from the cold. Over the following days, Maria helped the villagers restore at least part of what had been destroyed. She showed how to reinforce walls with stones, how to create a barrier from the wind, how to properly position the hearth so that smoke would go out and heat would remain. People listened to her now with respect, with gratitude, with shame for what they had done 2 months ago. Vasily once approached her and asked for forgiveness. The old man's voice trembled. He admitted that they were wrong, that they judged too hastily, that they exiled her when they should have helped. Maria listened to him and nodded. She did not say that she forgave, but she did not turn away either. Forgiveness would come later or would not come now. It did not matter. Now what mattered was to survive. Winter continued, but the village gradually recovered. People learned to live in a new way, with greater respect for nature, for the dangers of winter, for those they previously considered weak. Maria returned to the cave with her daughter. They still lived there. Although the village offered them a house, the woman refused. The cave had become their home, a real home that they created with their own hands. In spring, she planned to expand the shelter, make it even more comfortable, perhaps build a small hut nearby, but the cave would always be the foundation, the heart of their dwelling. Anna had grown during these months. She became strong, confident, brave. The girl no longer feared darkness, cold, or difficulties. She knew that she could cope with anything if her mother was nearby. And Maria knew the same. A year had passed since the day they were exiled from the village. Spring replaced winter, summer, spring, autumn, summer. The village of Kameny-Brod was restored, though not completely. Some houses remained in ruins, reminding of that terrible storm. Maria was now a respected member of the community. People came to her for advice on how to reinforce a house, how to prepare for winter, how to survive difficult times. She shared the knowledge she had acquired during a year of survival in the cave. Vasily died that spring. The old heart could not withstand what had been endured before leaving. He again asked Maria for forgiveness. This time, she said that she forgave. A young man named Ivan was elected the new elder. He was fair and wise. His first decision was to change the rules of the community, not to exile anyone without extreme necessity, to help the weak, not reject them. The village was learning from its mistakes. Maria and Anna still lived in the cave, but now it was not just a hole in the rock, but a real home. The woman expanded the entrance, built a small canopy in front of the cave where one could work in the rain. Inside there appeared shelves, beds, a place for storing supplies. The cave was warm, cozy, safe. Sometimes Maria stood at the entrance and looked at the village below. Lights burned in the windows, smoke rose from chimneys. Life went on as usual. But now the woman knew her strength was not in the village, not in other people, not in their approval or help. Her strength was in herself, in her hands that built a home from stones, in her will that did not break under the weight of exile, in her love for her daughter that gave strength to go forward when it seemed there was no more strength. Anna approached her mother and took her hand. They stood together, looking at the world that once rejected them, but now respected them. And Maria smiled, because she understood the most important thing. Home is not walls, and a roof. Home is the place where you feel safe, where you love and are loved, where you can be yourself. And her home was here in the cave on the hillside, with her daughter nearby, with fire in the hearth, with stones that protected them from the storm. Here was their home, and no one would ever take it away from them again. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments what city you're from. I'm very interested to know where my audience is watching from. The story is fictional. Any coincidences are random. Thank you for being with me.